Hello and welcome everyone to this colloquium on gods and robots, myths, machines, and ancient dreams of technology. And apologies for our delay this evening because of a technical hitch with YouTube. My name is John Tasulis and I'm the director of Oxford's new Institute for Ethics in AI. How are the ancient Greeks relevant to our efforts to grapple with the contemporary challenges posed by robots and AI? To discuss this question, I'm delighted to welcome our main speaker this evening, Adrienne Mayor, who is a research scholar in the Classics Department and the History and Philosophy of Science program at Stanford University. Adrienne is also the author of a marvelous book on this topic entitled Gods and Robots, Myths, Machines, and Ancient Dreams of Technology, published by Princeton University Press in 2018. Welcome, Adrienne.
Thank you.
I'm also very pleased to welcome our two distinguished commentators, Shadi Barcht-Zimmer, who is Helen A. Regenstein Distinguished Service Professor of Classics and the program in Gender Studies at the University of Chicago. Her most recent publication is the Aeneid, a new translation published by Random House last year. And Armand Dangour, who is Professor of Classical Languages and Literature at Oxford University and a Fellow of Jesus College. His books include Socrates in Love, The Making of a Philosopher, published by Bloomsbury in 2018. Welcome to you both. Now, at a quite fundamental level, the ancient Greeks are relevant because AI challenges our very self-conception as human beings, a self-conception that has been powerfully shaped by Greek thought. According to Plato and Aristotle, just to pick out two random ancient Greeks, we humans are essentially rational in nature, and our personal flourishing lies in the cultivation and exercise of our rational faculties. This self-conception still resonates today. For example, it's widespread in the notion of human dignity that plays such an important role, for example, in thinking about human rights. Even if, of course, it has taken a buffering over the centuries from various forms of naturalism and skepticism, some scientific, some postmodern. AI, however, confronts us uniquely with the prospect of artificial agents who can do things that normally require the exercise of human powers of reason. Things like making a medical diagnosis, or predicting the likelihood that a criminal will reoffend, or deciding whether credit should be extended to someone. But beyond this general point, Adrienne's book reveals that the Greeks are like us in addressing the challenge of robots and AI in two ways. First, that there were actual examples of automata to guide their reflections, like the philosopher, engineer, and friend of Plato, Archytas, who caused a sensation, apparently, with his mechanical flying dove. But second, and more importantly, because of the presence of automata in many of the ancient myths, from the bronze giant Talos to the ambiguous figure of Pandora. And like us, the Greeks veered between fear and hope in the face of the imagined technological advances that replicated or surpassed human powers of reason. As Adrienne puts it in her book, and I quote, "The unsettling oscillation between techno-nightmares and grand futuristic dreams is timeless. It is with us now, and it is present in the ancient Greeks' understanding of humanity's drive to transcend itself. Sometimes this drive to transcendence takes a noble form. All too often, however, it is a source of fear and dread, and it is surely instructive for us today, grappling with the power of big tech and AI-enabled government surveillance to subvert democracy in various ways, to observe that many of the most famous ancient automata, Talos and Pandora included, were created as expressions of absolute arbitrary power, whether of a vengeful god like Zeus or a tyrant like King Minos." So I'm very much looking forward to this discussion. Please remember that there is a Q&A session towards the end, so feel free to put your questions in the chat box on YouTube. But I have now very great pleasure in turning over to Adrienne. Adrienne.
Thank you, John. I'm so honored to be invited to this colloquium in AI ethics. I'm really looking forward to talking with you and Shadi and Armand and everyone else about how automatons were first imagined in classical antiquity. And for my book, I started with a question. Who first imagined robots, automatons, artificial intelligence, replicants? And historians of technology usually trace the first self-driven, self-driving machines to the Middle Ages using clockwork mechanisms. But we know that, as you just mentioned, Archytas was able to make a self-moving bird in the 4th century BC. And some philosophers of science, to my surprise, have argued that no one in antiquity could even imagine automatons before the technology existed, which is seems patently counterintuitive, because where does innovation come from if not from imagining things that don't already exist? And I do have some images tonight, so if we could have the first slide, Holly, that just shows the cover of my book and the two automatons and artificial entities that I'm going to be talking about tonight. I wondered, was it possible? I think we'll go to the first slide. Well, you can do that one, yeah. Was it possible that the idea, the concepts of making artificial life, automatons, and even AI could have appeared much earlier in history? Could people in antiquity actually imagine such things before technology ever made them possible? And it does turn out that more than 2,500 years ago, in the time of Homer, some vivid Greek myths did envision how one might fabricate artificial life, robots, and other synthetic beings. And these myths emerged long before the technological innovations of the Hellenistic era, beginning in the 4th century BC that I mentioned earlier. Long before that, people were imagining making artificial life. And I know this is a rather strange exercise for a very future-oriented group, but I'm inviting you to consider imaginative ideas about creating artificial life explored in mythic stories from more than 2 millennia ago. And these, you consider these myths, think of them as thought experiments. I think it's fun to call them the first ever science fiction tales. And then now the next slide, please. These artificial forms of life were described as made, not born. So that we know they were imagined as manufactured, not reproduced biologically or naturally. So we're not talking about just lifeless objects or inert matter that was brought to life by a magical spell or a god's command. I mean, there are stories like that. Every culture has stories like that. I'm talking today about entities that were imagined as products of what we might call biotechne, or life through craft. So these were technological products, and they were constructed by gods using familiar tools and materials and methods of the day. But because the makers were gods, they achieved awesome results. The next slide, please. And so today we'll start with the very first robot to walk the earth. And I'm talking about mythology, of course. This is Talos, the giant bronze automaton made by the god of invention and technology, Hephaestus, the blacksmith god. This is a very ancient oral tradition, and it was first written down in about 700 BC, around the time of Homer. And this famous ancient vase painting by the Talos painter shows Talos as a man constructed out of bronze. Talos was a killer robot. He was given by the god Zeus to his son, King Minos, to defend the kingdom of Crete from invaders. And Talos was able to march around the island 3 times a day. His task was to spot invaders, and then he could pick up boulders and hurl them at approaching ships to try and sink the ships. But Talos had other capabilities. In close combat, he could heat his metallic body, he's made of bronze, heat his body red hot, and then grab up victims and crush them to his chest and roast them alive. Next slide, please. Yes, these capabilities are shown on ancient coins from Crete. You see him throwing rocks or boulders, and the bronze mirror, he is crushing some victims. Remarkably, we even know something about the automaton's inner workings, and I think these details confirm his technological origins. Talos had a single tube or artery running from his head to his foot, but instead of blood, ichor is what pulsed in that conduit or tube, and ichor was the mysterious life force of the gods. That's what made them immortal. This entire viva system was sealed with a bronze bolt on his ankle. So Talos does really fit the basic definition of a robot. He's a self-moving android. He has inner workings, he has a power source, and he interacts with his environment. And Talos was featured in the Greek myth about Jason and the Argonauts. They encountered Talos when they tried to drop anchor in Crete to rest after gaining the Golden Fleece. Next slide, please. And this scene is from the vintage cult movie Jason and the Argonauts from 1963. Maybe some of you are familiar with it. It's highly recommended just for the stop motion animation. And I like to talk about movies when I'm talking about Greek myths because after all, they're all cultural dreams. In the myth, Jason and the Argonauts were doomed to become the victims of Talos, but luckily for them, the powerful sorceress Medea was able to save them from Talos. She's a resourceful and clever witch. Medea figured out how to destroy, neutralize, and kill the bronze robot, and she used, I think it's interesting, a combination of persuasion and technology to do that. Medea was able to convince Talos that someday he would die, and then she promised that she could make him immortal, but only if he would allow them to remove the vital bolt on his ankle. And unaware of his own nature, Talos agreed to that. Next slide, please. Medea and Jason unsealed the bolt so that the automaton's power source, the ichor, would bleed out completely. And that is what killed him. The remarkable idea of using a tool to dismantle Talos. That's another very ancient idea in the myth. And we know it goes back at least to the 5th century BC because we have vase paintings like this one from about 440 BC that showed Jason actually using a tool to remove the bolt, the robot's weak point on his ankle. And the robot's power source, ichor, we hear that it flowed out like molten lead, and Talos collapses and topples over. I think all these details from the myth and the artwork emphasize that Talos was not only made with technology, but he was destroyed with technology, with the tool. So Talos was imagined as a metallic automaton, but with some human features. So he's kind of envisioned as a kind of cyborg, a machine-human hybrid. The techno-wizard Medea was able to guess that Talos might have developed or had some human-like desires, and she played on that. For example, Talos feared death. He wished to be immortal, and Talos could be persuaded and fooled by Medea, the more humanoid features that Medea could exploit. Talos was a fearsome machine then, but his human aspects also made him a sympathetic figure in antiquity. Now, today, psychologists try to figure out why do we tend to anthropomorphize robots and feel empathy for them as though they were human. We do seem to be hardwired to bestow emotions on things that somehow seem alive to us. And of interest to those who work in AI and robotics, studies do show that empathy is especially likely for robots and AI if the entity has a name and a backstory about their creation, as Talos did. Next slide, please. And a famous modern example of that, some of you might remember the Stanley Kubrick film 2001, A Space Odyssey from 1968, another cult movie, the iconic scene when the astronaut Dave is destroying the spaceship's artificial intelligence computer, HAL. And HAL seems most human when he's being deactivated by the astronaut. As HAL is dying, he starts to tell his name and he begins to recite memories from his childhood. And this evokes sympathy in the audience. Well, in the 1963 film, Jason and the Argonauts, Talos doesn't really have any facial expressions, the bronze robot in the movie, but the animation sequence manages to suggest a glimpse of personality and intellect in the bronze giant. Next slide, please. And in that poignant movie scene, as his life force is bleeding out, the great robot struggles to breathe. You can see on the left there, he clutches his throat while his bronze body cracks and crumbles. And the modern audience feels pity for the helpless automaton. And human qualities are what make the robot's destruction feel tragic to us. And just like in antiquity, people felt sympathy for the robot who was tricked and killed while simply doing his job. And so in the ancient vase painting there in the center, made 2,500 years ago, the dying bronze Talos is humanized. His arms are limp. He's falling backwards as he's dying, and his eyes are rolling back. And I think what is even more striking and rare, the ancient artist has painted a teardrop falling from the robot's eye. Well, that ancient idea of an automaton guard, cast in human form like Talos, able to defend against invaders, that continued to capture people's imagination in the Middle Ages. Next slide, please. As you may know, Leonardo da Vinci designed a life-size robotic knight in armor in 1495. You can see on the left. And a century later, that idea was taken up by the poet Edmund Spenser. In his epic poem written in 1596, Spenser retooled that bronze robot Talos from Greek myth as the Iron Knight, also named Talos. And this Iron Knight was a grim enforcer companion given to Sir Artegall, who was a virtuous hero who traveled around the land trying to bring justice to lawbreakers. And the Iron Knight, Talos, was intended to help him bring law and order to the countryside, but it soon became a relentless killer robot, totally without mercy. Ultimately, this Iron Knight imposed iron law. The robot had no compassion, no mercy, and no interest in individual circumstances, motives, forgiveness, or remorse. And I think that brings up some interesting questions about AI and the law. Next slide, please. And now I'm returning to the ancient myth of Jason and the Argonauts. Talos was not the only deadly automaton that Medea had to overcome. Jason also had to survive the attacks of a pair of fire-breathing bronze bulls and an unstoppable automaton army. Those techno obstacles belonged to a powerful king who wanted Jason dead. And with Medea's help, Jason was able to subdue the terrifying robo bulls, and he yoked them to a plow. And next, Jason and his men had to fight and defeat the king's sinister army of invincible automatic warriors that popped out of the ground fully armed and programmed to attack. Next slide, please. And here we see a medieval image of those automaton soldiers emerging from the field, fully armed. These diabolical soldiers, they couldn't be commanded or ordered. They couldn't retreat or halt. They're sort of hardwired to attack. And the army of androids advance on the nearest enemy, which is Jason and the Argonauts. And once again, Medea to the rescue. Medea figures out how to take advantage of the encoding that's imprinted in this unnatural army. Just as she exploited the bronze robots' weak points, she hit on a clever way to trigger them to self-destruct. Well, I just want to point out that if you're facing machines of malice, you want Medea or someone like her on your side. She really is an ancient version of a brilliant hacker. And I think these myths show that the Greeks understood that even the most awesome technology can have weaknesses, vulnerabilities that can be exploited, and that automatons do not always perform as expected by the maker or those who deploy them. Now, Talos and the bronze bulls were just some of the many marvelous automatons that were made for powerful kings by Hephaestus. And as the god of invention, Hephaestus really had an impressive resume of animated androids and self-moving devices that he made for the gods and for himself and the other gods. Hephaestus is interesting because he's the only god with a job. He's the only god who sweats. He's always pictured hard at work. He's using familiar tools, materials, and methods that people saw in real workshops and forges on Earth. But as I mentioned, because Hephaestus was the god of invention and technology and blacksmithing and forges, his imaginary creations were marvelous, far beyond the dreams of what any mere mortal craftsperson could achieve. And next slide, please. For example, Homer tells us that he made automated gates for the heavens so the gods could drive their chariots back and forth with ease. Kind of the first automatic garage doors here. Hephaestus also built a fleet of self-driving vehicles. They were three-wheeled autonomous carts that delivered nectar and ambrosia to the gods' banquets and then returned when they were empty. Hephaestus constructed a set of self-regulating bellows for his forge. And according to Homer, in the Iliad, these automated bellows could blast more or less air depending on what was required by Hephaestus as he was working. But I think one of his most amazing inventions, maybe the most amazing invention, was a crew of life-sized, lifelike women made of gold. And these golden maidens served as his personal helpers. Homer describes them bustling around Hephaestus's workshop, and they were able to anticipate his every need. And Homer tells us that the golden maidens looked just like real young women, and these female androids were intelligent. They were endowed with strength and reason, and I think most astonishing, Homer says they were equipped with all the knowledge of the gods. So essentially, these lifelike automatons seem to possess what amounts to a mythological version of AI, all the knowledge of the gods, and they have strength and able to reason. The capstone, however, of Hephaestus's creations was yet another lifelike replicant. Like Talos, this one was designed to interact with humans on Earth. And this marvel was called Pandora. Next slide, please. Now, I want to point out that the Pandora in the original myth was not anything like the fairy tale version that most of us have heard of in our childhoods. Pandora was not an innocent, curious young woman who, with a tragic case of curiosity, couldn't resist opening a forbidden box or jar, inadvertently unleashing a swarm of evils on the world. The original story of Pandora is much darker. The myth was first written down by Hesiod about 700 BC, around the same time that Homer was describing the golden female servants, and some of the wording that the two authors use is very similar. Hesiod's description makes it very clear that Pandora was an artificial young woman, made, not born. And in the myth, the king of the gods, Zeus, very vengeful and harsh tyrant, decides to take revenge on human beings for accepting the gift of fire that was stolen by Prometheus. Zeus commands Hephaestus to fabricate an evil disguised as beauty in the form of a lovely and seductive young woman. This is to be a trap for humans. Zeus, we are told, takes malicious glee in this cruel trick. He's laughing out loud as he gives the instructions to Hephaestus, telling him to give this bewitching young artificial woman the power to move on its own. Next, he orders the gods and goddesses to come and bestow gifts, capabilities, and personality traits on Pandora. Athena dresses her in fabulous garments. Of Aphrodite, the goddess of love, fills Pandora with irresistible sex appeal, and Hermes, the messenger god, instills Pandora with a deceitful, shameless nature. So this deceptive fembot, kind of AI agent in the shape of a young woman, was to be sent by Zeus down to Earth, carrying a sealed jar filled with evils to plague mortals forever. And her only mission on Earth was to open that fateful jar and release eternal misery and suffering on humankind. Next slide, please. And here we have a vase painting of Zeus admiring Pandora, made to his specifications before sending her to Earth. And you can see she looks like a statue or a doll. And I think it's interesting to cast this myth in robotic AI terms. And this is thanks to AI philosopher George Zarkadakis. He points out that the word used for Zeus coming up with the intellectual concept of Pandora, he uses the word, Hesiod says he crafts that idea. Then Zeus commissions Hephaestus to build the basic hardware. Hephaestus makes this female replicant lifelike enough to be accepted as a real young woman by humans. The other gods then supply the operating system by giving Pandora various humanoid functions and properties. And by Zeus's design specifications, Pandora is programmed to open and then close the jar of evils and therefore accomplish her mission on Earth. Next slide, please. And this is the magnificent Niobe vase, more than a foot tall, that shows Zeus showing off the completed figure of Pandora to all the gods. And I can give you some better details so you can see the figures a little better. In the next slide, please. And in the top row, you see Zeus seated on his throne on the left there, and Pandora is in the top row center, facing out, looking at us. All the gods and goddesses, as you can see, are very active. They're lively. They're filled with awe at this realistic artificial woman. They're gesturing and talking. And in the next slide, a close-up of Pandora. Next slide, please. In contrast, Pandora is standing there stiffly like a statue. She's gazing out at us with a kind of uncanny smile. And as one art historian says, she looks like a wind-up doll about to be activated. And what's remarkable is that in vase paintings of this time, faces looking straight out at the viewer, that's very rare. A full frontal face indicates a kind of mindlessness. It's appropriate for dead bodies or inanimate things like masks or statues. And frontal views like this can also suggest a mesmerizing gaze. And I think on this vase, both of those effects, a blank mind and a kind of compelling gaze, seem to be intended by the artist. And the other remarkable thing is facial expressions are also extremely rare in vase painting, but this Pandora is smiling at us. That statue-like appearance, that creepy smile, they represent Pandora as a kind of wicked automaton, and that fits. He sees a depiction of Pandora as evil, described as beauty. And here I have another movie reference. Next slide, please. Pandora, I think, is eerily reminiscent of the evil robot Maria in the great silent film Metropolis, which was made in 1927, made just a few years after the invention of the word robot. Next slide, please. Already in Metropolis, that film shows that already by 1927, people were already imagining a future techno-dystopia where the rich ruling class oppress miserable workers with automation and robots. And I think the scene of those artificial women being prepared is quite striking. Well, to return to the Greek myth, next slide, please. Zeus orders Hermes to escort Pandora to Earth and present her as a bride to a man named Epimetheus. And here we see that, and the guy in the middle there is Hermes finding amusement in the whole interchange. Prometheus, humanity's protector, tries to warn Epimetheus not to accept this nefarious gift from Zeus. But Epimetheus ignores the warning. He's dazzled by Pandora's beauty, and he, according to Hesiod, accepts the gift from Zeus and only realizes his terrible error too late after she's opened the jar. And the names here are significant. In ancient Greek, Prometheus means foresight, looking ahead. Epimetheus means hindsight. And that makes him the perfect patsy for Zeus's cruel trap. And I guess we could draw a lesson here, I think. Maybe as the science of robotics and AI advances at a relentless rate, maybe we need a few more Promethean thinkers and not just Epimethean people going for short-term gains without looking ahead. And also notice that Hephaestus's self-moving devices and automatons they're charming, they're harmless, they're benevolent when they're confined to the heavenly realm, when they're used by the gods and goddesses up in heaven. But when Zeus sends automatons to Earth, things go badly for humans. You could say that Isaac Asimov's laws get broken when they come to Earth. And the myths seem to be suggesting, or we can take this lesson that maybe these things are good to think about in the abstract, but you have to take great care when they interact on a human plane. I think another point to ponder is the association between technology and tyranny. It's arousing a lot of concern today. And we can notice who commissions and deploys automatons in these myths. It's people with power. It's the gods, especially the tyrannical god Zeus, and powerful kings. And technology then was linked with tyranny very early in human history in these myths, but this pattern also occurred in real historical times in antiquity, with examples going back to at least the 6th century BC, with powerful kings commissioning machines to kill and torture others. I think Prometheus is a valuable model for those who are thinking about or seeking to create artificial life, because he is the one who's always looking out for humankind. And according to myth, it was Prometheus who made the first human being. And there's an amazing set of engravings, more than 60 of them, engravings on tiny gems worn as rings or made as seals that depict Prometheus as a kind of engineer using tools to construct the first human prototype. Next slide, please. He's working step by step, working from the inside out, beginning with the internal framework, the skeleton, and then he will add muscles and tendons and internal organs and flesh. And these gems are from about 300 to 100 BC. After he made humans, and we hear this from Sappho very early in Greek literature, Sappho says that that he stole the technology of fire after he made the first human beings. And he stole the fire because he was worried about the naked, vulnerable humans surviving in the harsh world. So he stole the technology of fire and taught the first men and women crafts and how to use fire, which allowed them to begin to invent language and plan cooperatively together all sorts of hallmarks of civilization and culture. And as I'm sure many of you recall, Mary Shelley's great science fiction novel of 200 years ago, 1818, Frankenstein, it was subtitled A Modern Prometheus. And comparing the Prometheus of Greek myth with the modern scientist in that novel, Victor Frankenstein, one is struck with the question of what creators might owe to their creations of artificial life. And Victor Frankenstein, you recall, was repulsed by his creation. It was monstrous, and he disowned it in the end. While Prometheus remains a kind of archetype of the responsible creator who tries to help his creations. Well, I think these examples from literature and art do show that the ability to imagine making artificial life, automatons, robots, has more ancient roots than most people realize. We can trace these cultural dreams of technology all the way back to the myths of classical Greece, first written down between the 8th and 7th century BC. And here I do want to mention that the Greeks were not unique in imagining automatons or artificial life. Stories about making artificial life also appear in ancient India and China as well. So it is clear that automatons were not only thinkable long before the technology was available or existed, but many of the practical and ethical issues about imitating nature, they're foreshadowed in these ancient myths if you really look closely. Myths about what one could achieve if one had advanced biotechnique. So just to conclude, it probably seems ironic to be looking back to the ancient past, but I've asked you to time travel more than 2 millennia to consider some of the first science fiction tales. But I do hope that the sophistication and the relevance of these ancient dreams and the qualms that they express about technology might enrich our understanding of the timeless link between imagination and science. I look forward to hearing comments and questions.
Thank you so much, Adrienne. That was a really fascinating presentation and some spectacular images there. So now I want to turn to our first commentator, Professor Shadi Barch-Zimmer. Shadi.
I've enjoyed thinking with Adrienne Mayor's pioneering work on gods and robots in antiquity. Modern AI has many manifestations, of course, and Mayor's study leans towards the idea of the robot. That is, the thing made, not born, the thing that shares some qualities with human life, whether veins funneling ichor, the ability for spontaneous movement, or the modicum of intelligence needed to serve a glass of wine, a function which even my dog has not mastered. Another model for modern AI is that embraced by corporations such as Amazon, Google, Facebook, and IBM. Machine learning systems dedicated to forms of cognition associated with human intelligence, such as learning, problem solving, and pattern recognition. Yet another category of AI common today includes what we might call human enhancing devices, like Daedalus's wings. That is, forms of technology that allow us to transcend human abilities while retaining our own humanity, at least for a while. Mayer's book touches on this last sort of AI in passing, but I'd like to expand on her observations in my comments for this panel. To do so, I should first point out that most scholars treat ancient Greek techne, craft skill, as distinct from the modern term technology. As Stanley Rosen, George Grant, and Arthur Meltzer have argued, technology tries to bend nature to our will, a stance that takes the offensive in seeking to combat or transcend the natural world. It also brings with it the potential for ruin. Did the ancients think about technology in that sense as well? I'd suggest that the answer is yes, and that we can find in Sophocles the first stirrings of fear about technology over 2 millennia before our time. Dr. Mayer's robot Talus, of course, does not seek to conquer nature except by dint of being unnatural. In confusing the boundary between the animate and the inanimate, Talus does count in modern terms as a sort of technology. On the other hand, Talus fails what we might call the Stanley Rosen test for AI. He is a wonder, but he does not have the potential to ruin the world. Daedalus's wings are more complicated. In transcending nature, they lead to individual death by AI, but their impact is limited to those who choose to wear them. It is instead in the famous Deinos ode of Sophocles' Antigone, I'd suggest, that Rosen's criteria are met. In that choral ode, the chorus sings, quote, "Many things are formidable, Deinos, none more formidable than man. He crosses the gray sea beneath the winter wind, passing beneath the surges that surround him, and he wears away the highest of the gods, earth, immortal and unwearying, as his plows go back and forth from year to year, turning the soil with the aid of the breed of horses." End quote. According to the chorus, man has also conquered birds and beasts and fish and disease, everything besides death. Skillful beyond expectation is his techne, the chorus adds, and so he advances sometimes to evil, at other times to good. When he applies the laws of the earth and the justice of the gods, he may remain in the city. If his aim is gain, however, he must be cast out. Techne, as this chorus sees it, strives to overcome the harshness of nature as a whole. It is large scale and offensive. The chorus's treatment of cleverness, de notes, also corresponds with Aristotle's view in the Nicomachean Ethics 6:12 that it may be used for good or for evil. It is the latter when it stops at nothing, when it encompasses all doing, panurgia. And when is that? The answer lies in the fact that the chorus speaks of the laws of the earth, not the city, and the justice of the gods, not of men. The earth and the gods must be the arbitrators of large-scale offensive techne, even in Sophocles. Techne, or as Rosen would call it, technology. The earth and the gods represent the needs of our planet and an ethical system uncorrupted by human desire. Anyone who violates these ethical ends for profit is a danger. Is this not a harbinger of modern technology, clad in the pelt of techne? Jacques Ellul, in The Technological Society, argues that more efficient techniques will always triumph over lesser ones, and that man has no control over this ironclad rule. In other words, that neither human ethics nor the welfare of our planet can stop us, let alone will. Sophocles' chorus may have hoped that we could avert this by removing the facilitators of technology from human society, but we have not, and the fears that the chorus voiced may have proven all too true. Here, I think, is the most terrible intimation in antiquity of what AI and technology could bring thousands of years later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shadi. And now we'll pass on to a second commentator, Armand Dango. Armand.
Thank you very much. I much enjoyed hearing Adrienne talk about her book, which I think is terrific, and Shadi's comments. Thank you. I'd just like to make three broad points, or touch on three issues, which relate to the connection between the kind of thing we've heard about in the classical world, in the world of ancient Greece, and modern AI. As Shadi said, the kind of thing that Adrienne was concentrating on, at least in the talk, was really to do more with robots and tools and things created. Whereas, of course, we tend to think of artificial intelligence as much more how we can achieve certain kinds of goals through understanding the way people think, or the way we can create artificial ways of thinking. The kind of thing that a Turing test looks into, for example, it does this thing, whether it's a computer or monitor or something, make us think this could be the same level as we are on a human, in terms of human intelligence. So one thing that it made me think was, what would have been the equivalent in the ancient world of having access to some kind of intelligence, particularly predictive intelligence? Because if one thinks about it, a lot of what science is doing is trying to say, look, we want to think about how things will be in the future and how that may benefit us individually or collectively. And of course, the answer in the ancient world is purely supernatural. It is the access to divine minds, such as that of the god Apollo, through the operation of an individual such as the Delphic oracle, the young woman who was said to have gone into a trance. Apollo invested this woman's body and mind, and from her mouth came intelligence. People believed deeply in the Delphic oracle. They would go and ask questions of it, and what the oracle said was taken very seriously, though of course famously the Delphic oracle was ambiguous. So what it said could be interpreted, but was likely to be misinterpreted according to the wishful thinking of the recipient. So that's just one aspect of the idea that artificial intelligence is seeking some kind of access to knowledge, but that access may well deceive us through our own projection of what we want onto that thing. So the second point I just want to take up is what Shadi was saying about the dangers of technology being both potentially good and bad. And one of the things that I looked into for many years and ended up in my book, The Greeks and the New in 2011, was how the Greeks thought about novelty and innovation. And the standard trope in ancient studies was the Greeks didn't like anything new. But there's a whole book devoted to that in the 1950s called In the Grip of the Past. And that is the bottom line. The Greeks didn't like anything new. And this is about a culture which invented philosophy, theatre, the first monetary economy, logic, mathematical proof, you could go on. How is it that these people, despite not liking anything new, managed to be so massively innovative? I mean, they really were masochists, weren't they? So one of the things that my book sought to do was show that there were areas in which they not only sought the new, but they promoted it as a good thing. And when one looks into the history of ancient thinkers talking about innovation, it's actually hard to find any treatise that talks about the new as such. About the closest we come to it is Aristotle's Politics, in which he talks about innovative constitutions, ways in which people came up with imaginative ideas about how to create a new kind of a governmental constitution. And of course, Plato's Republic is one of those. It's a utopia, and Aristotle criticizes it. He also talks about some of the communistic schemes that were suggested. There was a man called Phaleas of Chalcedon he talks about, who came up with the idea of sharing property in common. I mean, extraordinary proto-communism. And Aristotle comes up with some very good, sensible objections to why it's not going to work, basically because of human nature. And he talks about a man called Hippodamus, who, amongst other things, was a very great city planner, and he worked out the grid system that was used in the Piraeus. And he said he was a very flamboyant and innovative individual. And amongst other things, he suggested that there should be a prize instituted for innovative political ideas. So a prize for coming up with a good new kind of constitution. So the idea of a prize, of course, leads us to the thought of incentives. The Greeks were very keen on rewards and prizes. I mean, they were very competitive, and they thought, if there's a good prize and you can incentivize things, then people will come up with new ideas. So I think that that's an area of Greek society which showed how keen they were on innovation. Now, of course, we can talk about a lot of the actual technological innovations that happened in a slightly later period, the Hellenistic and other periods, essentially to do with hydraulics and steam combustion and so on, which was the principle on which Archytas' dove flew. In fact, it was a kind of steam-powered dove. Those things never quite got off the ground. I once gave a talk on ancient aeronautics with a bit of a tongue-in-cheek, and I said, flying was of great interest to the ancient Greeks, but it never quite got off the ground. Nonetheless, as I said at the time, flying was in the air in the 5th century BC. I mean, there was a lot of interest in this idea of using wings. There's a play called, the comedy called The Birds by Aristophanes, where people don wings and pretend to be birds. And you can imagine people trying out flying in that way. But what is interesting is that a lot of that goes back to Daedalus, as we heard from Shadi, and the invention of man-powered flight by this inventive man, inventive in all kinds of ways he was supposed to have been. One of them was that he built the wings for his son Icarus, and of course failed tremendously. But where does that very early myth come from? It seems to be connected to the Greeks' connections to ancient Egyptian sailing technology. And if you think about it, when people first come across certain kinds of technology, they think, my goodness, maybe that means, what are these boats doing? They're actually capturing the wind in sails and flying across the sea. So maybe we can adapt that kind of technology and think about using it for flying. So the idea of techne then as something that might be good or bad, most of the ancients, in any text that you read, thought that any kind of attempt to scale the sea was a bad thing. Sailing was basically seen as negative. I mean, it was very dangerous. There were frequent shipwrecks. They're all over the Mediterranean, boats at the bottom of the Mediterranean. So sailing itself was bad enough. Flying would go one step further. And of course, the whole myth of Icarus is dressed up in this idea that he's committing a hubris by attempting to fly too close to the sun. Look, I can fly. His wax wings melt and he falls and becomes the name of the Icarian Sea. And so the third point I want to bring up is the idea of an orientation towards the future. Because that, it seems to me, is something that changes in the history of the classical world as we know it. One very simple, concrete example of this is that when we read in Homer about the prophet Calchas, we're told he could see behind him. He could not only see in front of him, he could see behind him. And what that means is he could not only see the past, which was in front of him, there it is, spread out in front of us. I mean, you know, that was what Calchas could see, but he could see behind, which was the future. And so one has to imagine that the idea, the imagination of the Greeks at that age was something like this. We're traveling in a cart, traveling backwards into the future. We can't see what's going to happen behind us. It might hit us suddenly. We can, of course, look and see what happens in the past because it's right in front of our eyes. But we really feel quite blind to the future. As I mentioned, there's divination, there's the idea of prophecy. You can perhaps glimpse occasionally behind you, like Calchas the prophet, and see what's coming. But on the whole, we are blind to the future, we are facing the past. And then something changes in the middle of the 5th century BC, the sort of period around 440 when Sophocles is writing his Antigone and that ode talking about the formidable nature of human beings. They can do basically anything. The only thing they can't do is stop us from dying. We've created medicine, we've created our agriculture, we've created cities and ideas and all those sorts of things. It's this wonderful celebration of human ability. And in that century, we find texts where, on the whole, the idea of the future is something that we can look forward to. The idea of progress first emerges in some form during that century. The idea that, for example, in medicine, we can look forward to a future in which one day, by analyzing disease and health, we can eventually attain the whole of medical knowledge. They actually say that in some of the Hippocratic treatises. They're so ambitious. They realize that we can actually do it. Human beings are now striding forward confidently into a future which is ours. And of course, there are dangers with that view as well, because in some ways, it is a much more realistic point of view to suggest we simply are traveling backwards. Our faces are oriented towards the front. And so this image of us as traveling forwards into the future is potentially very dangerous, because actually we are not looking at the future. We are imagining the future, and we're imagining the future based on the past. And so I think this comes very nicely back to what Adrienne has said, because she has managed to increase our sense of the imaginative resources that the ancient Greeks brought to the idea of artificial imagination. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emma. That's an excellent discussion so far. Let me ask Adrienne, is there anything you'd like to pick up, Adrienne, on what's been said before we go to questions? You'll need to unmute, though.
Yes, I really enjoyed those comments, all very astute, especially enjoy the reference to Sophocles' paean to human ingenuity and how it could either be used for good or evil. And that tendency to imitate, improve, and surpass nature. And as I think Shadi pointed out, that is there a feeling of danger to, by automatons or technology, is there a danger to more than just individuals and sort of a mass danger? And I think Armand mentions this too, about technology and competition and rewards and prizes. And so if you look at what did the Greeks use technology for, practical technology for, it's for theater and religion and spectacle and war. And no one has mentioned war machines yet, but novel machines of war were rewarded by powerful kings and rulers, starting with maybe Dionysus of Syracuse in 400, invited inventors and artisans and engineers to a contest to make advanced weapons of war. And the competition spurred them, and this what resulted in the first torsion catapults, I believe, the first mechanized catapults. And now we're taking these prizes and contests continue. Philip II of Macedon also rewarded military engineers. So did Demetrius Poliorcetes for siege machines, and Mithridates the Great also had many engineers who built innovative war machines in his court. So, and then of course Archimedes, who also built a lot of technological machines for war. So there we see that what you predicted, Armand, of competition and the idea that there will be prizes for innovation, it's all right there in war technology. So we military engineers inventing in order to be rewarded.
Military industrial complex of the ancient world.
There we go. And I as I pointed out in my book, DARPA, the military scientists of the Pentagon, were building an advanced exoskeleton that would be have human enhancements and AI and make soldiers invulnerable. And what did they name it? They chose an acronym, TALOS, tactical attack. I can't remember what the acronym was, but they knew the story of Talos, and they wanted to make their soldiers invulnerable like Talos. So
one of the things I sometimes ask is why the Greeks didn't go on and invent the kind of technological advances that we see ourselves. I think there's every reason that they could have done had it not been that they were concentrating on military technology and conquest. Because, you know, if they invented hydraulics and steam machines already in the 3rd century, we'd have had an industrial revolution had it not been for Alexander's desire and his successor's desire to conquer the world and divide it up. So Demosthenes says we have reached an age in which we have come to the end of innovation because it's all military. And I think that must have been the case.
Yeah.
Though it is kind of interesting to note that a lot of our contemporary innovations are also driven by military spending, but I guess in a very broad sort of way. Let me go to a question from our audience. This is from Liz. She asks, did the Greeks and Romans think of progress in a linear way? Did they think society was improving, or did they have a different way of viewing time? This connects up a little bit with Armand's comments at the end. Anyone want to take that up?
Maybe I could. Oh, go ahead, Adrienne.
And before you comment, I want Armand to comment on it, but I was struck by your idea of whether the past is in front of us or behind us. And there are anthropological studies of various cultures that imagine, how do they imagine their ancestors? Do they imagine themselves at the head of the line of the ancestors behind them? Or are they marching behind their ancestors? And there are differences in various cultures. And as you say, the Greeks had the idea that that they were one way and then began to change. So now I think you should answer the question.
Right. Well, just in response to that question, famously, the Greeks, the earliest Greeks believed in regress, not in progress. So Hesiod in the 8th to 7th century gives the myth of how human society has simply regressed over various different ages, from a golden age far in the past to a Bronze Age, an Iron Age, and and the next stage is going to be even worse, he says. So that myth of regress is quite common in the ancient world, and you find it all the way through, even into Roman times. But alongside that, and beginning in the 5th century, basically as exemplified exactly by the Antigone Ode, which Shadi read out, you have this sense of increasing ability, a growth in capacity of human abilities and knowledge, which will lead to a better future. So famously, E.R. Dodds wrote a book called The Greek Idea of Progress. It's a series of essays in which he talks about how there is this switch towards an idea of progress, but it's not our idea of progress, which is some continuous linear one, which is mentioned by the questioner. It's that in certain areas, in certain ways, we can do better in future, and we will. But I think that basic idea that things are always getting worse, and certainly morally worse, is continuously present in the ancient world.
And they also tend to look at past societies as having advanced technology. For instance, the way the Greeks looked at Egypt and building the pyramids and things like that. So there's this idea that people in the past, whether in real history or remote history or myth, had advanced technology that we don't have now.
Shadi, do you want to talk about the Roman conception?
It's the same in the Roman world, this idea of falling away from a state of moral purity, an age in which the earth gave up its goods automatically without man having to toil for them, which seems to be a universal story, very much reminiscent, for example, of the Adam and Eve story, in which it's only after the fall that Adam has to scrabble in the fields and Eve has to bear the pains of childbirth. So definitely in the Roman world, yes. And one of the propaganda points that Augustus leans on heavily when he comes to power after 31 BC is that he's going to reverse this moral decay. And one of the things he does is he restores all the ancient temples in the city of Rome as part of this new way of thinking about who the Romans are and what they're accomplishing during this first Pax Romana.
Can I ask a follow-up about this? Because, Armand, you talked about a shift in the understanding of time and the future as something we can look forward to. How does that relate to conceptions of hope? So, for example, in the Pandora myth, there's a suspicion that hope is a mug's game, that basically it's this optimistic attitude you have basically on the basis of ignorance or someone's manipulating you. Do we then get Elpis or hope becoming something that is closer to, say, the understanding of it as a virtue, or at least an element of a virtue, as this change happens?
Yes, I mean, so I think, again, textually, you can find examples, and again, in the Hippocratic corpus in some of the treatises, that very word is used, Elpis. There is a hope, they say, that we will get the whole knowledge of health and disease. So that is sometime late 5th century, probably, that treatise. Before that, and Adrienne deals with this very nicely, in Hesiod, you have this jar of evils, all the evils that come into the world, and what is left is hope. So on the face of it, hope is yet one other evil, but it's the one that is retained. So the idea that hope itself is blind, that hope is not something that we really want to have, but we are left with it, it's a very hard image to interpret. But the implication, I think, is that Hesiod thought hope was yet one of the other evils, because hope is vain. Hope is not knowledge, and that is what's left. And I think that can also be traced as something that changes, hope as bad expectation, turning into hope as good expectation over the course of the few centuries.
If I could add a little footnote to that, Armand mentioned the pronouncements of the Oracle of Apollo as being a way of imagining the future in antiquity. And I just wanted to point out that every single literary representation we have of those oracles being uttered show us that they are misinterpreted through the hope of the person receiving the pronouncement. So for example, I think it's Croesus or somebody else hears from the oracle, "You will destroy a great empire." And off he rushes with his army, assuming that the empire he destroys will not be his own, which of course it is. So hope is very destructive in that context.
Brilliant. Adrienne, I'm going to ask you a really silly question, but you depicted Prometheus building a human. So how is a human then different from Pandora, who's also built?
Yeah.
And there we have the philosophical question that is still being pondered. I mean, if you think of the Gnostics, for instance, they believe that we were all products of incompetent demiurges, and Plato actually is one of the first to express that question. He says, let's imagine, or let's pretend, or let's consider that we are all puppets of the gods. So it certainly brings up all sorts of questions of autonomy and free will. If we are but a technological project of Prometheus, how do we have free will? it goes on and on. I mean, that question is still pondered, of course.
Let me ask you this question from Stan Gilmore. He says, Pandora, who's AI or a robot, and Epimetheus, rather foolish, gave birth to Pyrrha, mother of Helen, father of Greece, by Deucalion. So AI stopped humanity from dying out and brought forth a grand civilization. Do we owe it all to AI?
Brings up very complex, interesting questions about whether or not artificial life can reproduce itself, whether replicants like Pandora or Galatea in the Pygmalion story, could they reproduce? We never hear anything about Pandora after she has opened the jar, completed her mission on Earth in Greek literature. The story that she actually married Epimetheus and reproduced, had offspring, I believe comes from Ovid, Roman writer, who could not resist saying that she was so lifelike that she could have babies. And that's where the story comes from, that she did reproduce. And I think it's Hyginus, an even later Roman writer, who says that Pygmalion and Galatea also had children. So I think that's just a science fiction tendency that people just couldn't resist thinking about. And it's, of course, the theme of Blade Runner 49, the most recent Blade Runner film, turns on the mystery of the question of whether or not a replicant woman could actually give birth. So I just think that's probably a bit of ancient science.
I should say that, of course, the first man has to be made out of clay, whether it's in the Greek tradition or in the Hebrew tradition, the biblical tradition. Adam, he's earth. And there is this misogynistic element, common to ancient societies, whereby women is secondary. Eve is made out of Adam's rib. Pandora comes along to destroy the sort of, wonderful life that men are having. So I think one has to accept that there are certain culturally specific ways of thinking about both men and women, but nonetheless that initially there has to be animate from inanimate, and anima is breathed into clay. After that, you have human reproduction, apart from individual creations.
There is another story about Hephaestus making various robotic guard dogs for various kings to guard their palaces. And a later Roman writer, then it might be Hyginus, claims that the best Molossian hounds actually, they were descendants of the robotic dogs of gold and silver that were made by Hephaestus. So once again, it's just a natural science fiction type of idea. There's an interesting, many cultures have the idea that the first humans were made from mud or clay, soil and water, or tears or blood, something like that. But it's rare that they have any technology or techne associated with them. The biblical story doesn't really have craft associated with the creation, whereas the images of Prometheus do show him using tools, and it's technological. The only other ancient story I know that's similar to the Prometheus type of story is the Egyptian myth of Catoon, and I'm not pronouncing it correctly, who was the god who made the first humans, and he is the god of the potter's wheel, which is technology that was perfected in Egypt in about 3000. And he is shown creating the first humans on a potter's wheel, which involves technology plus the clay and the earth and water. So I think that's a really interesting difference in those ancient stories of the first humans.
Can I ask a question about a trope that came up that is very popular, which is that of robots or AI as merciless? So we had a discussion recently in the Institute about autonomous weapon systems. One of the objections to deploying them in war is that, unlike a human soldier, they wouldn't show mercy towards other combatants or non-combatants. So the question is, why is there this association, or in the Greek context, between mercilessness and being an automaton? Now, it's probably important to distinguish two ideas. One is the idea of equity. So the idea that you have a rule, but in a particular case, this rule doesn't apply. So you need the flexibility to realize that a rule shouldn't be applied rigidly in this case. So that's one idea, that there's a kind of flexibility in the application of rules, knowing when to deviate. But another is a more, I guess, probably more Roman in my view kind of idea in Seneca, that sometimes something is just, a punishment is justly deserved, but nonetheless, out of mercy, clementia, you might then moderate the justly deserved punishment. Why is there this link between mercilessness of either of these sorts and being an automaton in this Greek context? I mean, what are these robots lacking, in other words, that makes them merciless?
Well, they're half human and half machine, or partly more cyborg-like, and their humanity part seems to be about themselves rather than others. At least in the Talos story, he makes a bad decision based on what he wants. But what you're talking about, the drones and killing from afar, which caused a lot of ambiguous feelings in antiquity in Greece. The ambivalent feelings about archers, for instance, who can kill from afar without facing battle face to face. Now that it's brains over brawn, and so that's celebrated, of course. But there's also this feeling that ambush and arrows, or the technology of being able to kill from afar, is somehow inhumane, because it violates the principle of reciprocal risk. In face-to-face fighting, you have reciprocal risk. And with the drones and those kinds of modern weapons, we certainly don't have reciprocal risk. And we know that the Army, at least in the Gulf Wars, the early Gulf Wars, 1991, 2003, looked for soldiers who were really good at first-person video games, where you cannot have any mercy. You can't stop to think who you're killing. They looked for soldiers who were adept at that and had practiced getting rid of empathy for people they're killing.
I could just add something, which is that, of course, not all the robotic creatures, such as those Adrienne was talking about, are malign. So the golden assistants of Hephaestus are things that we'd all like to have in the house, really. But it seems to me that this is where another notion comes in, and that is the notion of the uncanny. And a lot of, I mean, Freud talked about das Unheimliche, which is the notion of the uncanny. It's related to the doppelganger. And the reason that a doppelganger is uncanny is because it is so like us. So we might see a square object which is emitting fire as threatening, but not uncanny or horrible, but something that looks like a human being, something that is quasi-human but isn't actually human, is much worse. And you know, you think of Planet of the Apes, or you think actually even of Daleks. I mean, God, how scared we were of those in the 1980s. They aren't really even human looking, but because they kind of talk and they move in a slightly uncannily human way. You know, that is, I think, what's going on, especially with these very lifelike robot characters like Talos.
Recently, Boston Dynamics just released a video of their incredibly advanced robots dancing, and they actually presented this as, see, our robots are less intimidating because they can dance. And I believe that many of us here are saying, no, that's the way fear, because I felt bad for all the graduate students in dance, mechanics and things like that, body movement, who were helping Boston Mechanics make these moves. These moves are for killer robots. And but this happens a lot. People who are making advanced technology present it to us as beneficial. For instance, we have lip reading cameras. This will be such a boon to, but we all know all the dark reasons that they're making those. So we need to be Promethean.
Let me ask one final question, and that is that it might be thought that for all the fears that technological advance and AI conjures up, the Greeks were immune to one of the fears that we have. Because a lot of people, when they think about the problems with AI, worry about the future of work. And they say, well, obviously work is a way of making a livelihood, so there is a financial or economic aspect to it. But it's also a source of self-respect and self-fulfillment. That for a lot of people, doing work is what gives meaning to their lives. And that they fear AI because even if there was a universal basic income, they would lose this source of meaning. I take it the Greeks didn't have this anxiety. They didn't value work in this way.
Well, the work would be considered more menial, at least in ancient Athens, where it was relegated to non-citizens and slaves, and the definition of the human was the man who participated in the life of the city and politics, which is what Greek citizen males of Athens did do. And so they simply found their meaning in a different realm. They had other people doing the hard work, the hard labor of farming or mining. They reaped the benefits themselves, and they could spend all their lives yakking it up in the assembly.
So that's great. So because John Maynard Keynes raises this question, he says, one of the few justifications for having the super rich is that they are pioneering for us what it would be like to have a meaningful life if you didn't have to work, if you weren't constrained by necessity. So do the Greeks have an answer to that anxiety, yakking it up? Is that the answer?
Look at the god of innovation. Look at the god of innovation, Hephaestus. He's always shown working. He's described as perspiring in his work. He doesn't have to do that. He's a god. On the other hand, he's a disabled god. So you can imagine that maybe that's why he builds all these practical aids. But we do have an example of all these gods and goddesses have lives of leisure to yak it up and gossip and this and that. They don't necessarily do philosophy like the ancient Greek elites imagined themselves doing, but there is one god who works hard.
Yes, and he was not a model for any ancient Greeks to aspire to, but more to the point, they didn't even aspire to being, for example, artists. There's a Lucian dialogue in which a young man who said, well, even if you could be Polykleitos, the great sculptor, or Phidias, you wouldn't want to be that. So that kind of work was not valued. And I should just remind you that in Aristotle's Ethics, when he talks about what makes us eudaimon, happy, what makes for well-being, what's his answer in book 10? Eternal contemplation of the truths of mathematics.
Absolutely.
So, what we have to do is find what makes human beings flourishing and happy that doesn't involve what we normally call work.
It's definitely the contemplation of mathematics. I know it.
Thank you very much, everyone. This has been an amazing discussion. Thank you, Adrienne, for that wonderful talk and the fantastic graphics. Thank you to our two excellent commentators, Shadi Bach and Armand Dangor. I just want to mention that on February the 16th, we will have our launch event on AI in a democratic culture. So please join us at 5 p.m. on February the 16th. Our speakers will be Professor Josh Cohen, Professor Helene Landmore, and Sir Nigel Shadbolt. So that will be a very interesting discussion about a number of very topical issues related to the interplay between AI and democracy. Thank you again for tuning in, and hopefully see you next week. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.